Welcome to another episode of Eric's Perspective. Joining me today is accomplished musician, composer, conceptual artist, Todd Cochran. Todd, thank you so much, man, for joining us today. I really appreciate you doing that and look forward to spending the next hour talking with you.
It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, and in full disclosure,
Yes.
Todd and I have been friends for many years.
Absolutely.
And I think it was through my gallery that we met, right? I mean, way back in the 80s, 90s, whenever it was. I can't remember
Yes.
exactly. Is that true?
It was in the 90s.
Yeah.
I do remember it because so our connection has always been music and art and music.
Yes.
Because I was producing Freddie Hubbard for Blue Note.
Yeah.
And there was a concept. Actually, the title of the album is "Times Are Changing."
Uh-huh.
And I wanted, a certain look, artwork,
Yes. Yes.
for it. And I forget even who the artist was, but it was something that you had. It was one of your artists or maybe someone who you represented. And I couldn't get the label to pay for that beautiful cover.
Well, I'm sorry that didn't happen.
That was it. Oh, yeah.
But I
and that was
appreciate
with
you thinking about it.
With Bruce Lundvall too, who was like, very, very, he was an art person, and so we've been friends since then.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
We had a very interesting beginning because you and I we were like it's very unusual. I'll always remember it because we were so kind of formal in getting to know each other.
Yeah.
You know what, man? We used to write cards to each other for like almost 2 years. That's how we communicated. You would write things to me, events going on in your gallery.
Yeah.
And then I would write you something. I mean, so we were actually, we didn't talk on the phone. We just sent each other cards. That was really just a very memorable and beautiful beginning, of our friendship.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And before we get going any farther, I just wanted to let everybody know that I'm sitting in my gallery, M. Hanks Gallery in Fullerton, and Todd is communicating us via Zoom from his home in the Los Angeles area. So just FYI there. But so Todd, I thought we'd get started just by exploring your beginnings as an artist, as a musician. What were and you were born in the Bay Area, and,
Yes.
and is it fair to say you were raised there as well, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And so, Can you tell everybody sort of how you got involved with music?
Well, I was born and raised in San Francisco, and arts were always central in my family, both with both of my parents. And actually, my parents had met each other at an arts lecture on a Sunday afternoon when they were in high school, seniors in high school in Chicago.
Oh, wow.
And actually, my father was on on the train with his girlfriend, who he had taken to the lecture. But my mother was there on the train. He let his girlfriend off and got off of the train and walked her there. And then before the train started again, he got back on the train and he connected with my mother. And then I think I came here about 7 or 8 years later. So but the music was always there. Both of my parents played music. My father was a pianist and vocalist.
Uh-huh.
And my mother was a violinist.
Oh, wow.
And neither that pursued music as their vocation, but it was always central to them. Arts, culture, and certainly the way Chicago was at that time, very, very segregated. And they went to DeSable High School, out of which very, very memorable and important artists came.
So when you say arts, it sounds like they were musically oriented, but they were also into the visual arts as well. Is that fair to say?
Very much so. And my grandfather was a person of letters, and actually he was on the board, the permanent board of the Chicago Institute of Art. And he was a literary person as well, and he would recite poetry and the great, from the Shakespeare, Chaucer, etc. That's where his orientation. My grandmother on my mother's side graduated from Tuskegee. My grandfather was a professor of mathematics. He was a PhD in mathematics. He was teaching at the University of Chicago, and then he went back to school and got his MD, and became his passion. He was his specialization. He was a OBGYN. He was an obstetrician.
Okay.
And he was very active, very forever involved.
Oh, that's remarkable.
Yeah, high culture.
And when you consider the time that they were operating in, where segregation was rearing its ugly head and racism and so forth, it's just another element to have to cope with.
And he was unstoppable.
That's wonderful
in terms of that. And then of course, when the Depression hit, he continued to see patients, when they could not pay.
Yeah.
He was much older than my grandmother. He passed away when my mother was 17 years old, in her, in her arms. And I think, she had my mother was very, very motivated and absolutely traumatized by the passing of her, by her father, but she really took on that. And there were some seeds of activism in that genetic code as well.
And I take it they took root in you as well, right? I mean,
yes, they did. That's what I said. Growing up in San Francisco at the time that I did, after the peak of the civil rights era, and then moving into certainly different aspects of Black nationalism and consciousness awakening, was very, very dynamic. And of course, San Francisco being a very progressive city, where the free speech movement began, UC Berkeley, the ACT was there, American Conservatory Theater, et cetera, et cetera. City Lights bookstore.
Yeah.
So I was exposed to these things very early. I saw Lorraine Hansberry's Raising in the Sun early in that period, and we used to go to see musical performers all of the time. That was something I did with my family, with my father and mother.
Oh, they took you. And what sort of music were they exposing you to at that early age?
Well, they both loved classical music. But I think, and I know that jazz and what we call classic jazz was, shared that pinnacle of their interest as well.
Yeah, I would imagine Duke Ellington and
Count Basie,
those folks.
Yeah, the Nicholas Brothers, et cetera, et cetera. It was, very, very dynamic, and there was some rigidity, with that. They were absolutely deft on me understanding the culture and having a historical perspective. So they really, really passed that along to me from a very early age. I mean, I was definitely aware of who I was. I would say I don't really remember a time where I was ever challenged by, not seeing where I was well defined, and capable of dealing with the world, because of that strong foundation. Very, very historical. My mother talked about meeting, I'll tell you, she talked about meeting Fannie Lou Hamer.
Oh my goodness.
She talked about Conti Cullen. I could really just, go on from there. And one person who was very important in my life as I was growing up was my grandmother. My grandmother was an evangelist, and she had parishes in 3 cities. And so she lived in Los Angeles, and this is with 3 children and a husband who left a few years after my father was born. 3 children. And so she had parishes in Los Angeles, in Boston, and in Chicago.
Wow.
So she was based in Chicago, which is where my my folks met. And so she is, so I think she was pretty much, she was a proto-feminist. She spoke beautifully, she wrote beautifully, she had, you know, she was, yeah, she had oration skills, very strict, very connected to spirit. And that was a, you know, big impression on me, lifelong impression. In fact, my connection with my paternal grandmother was so natural and dynamic that I know there was always a thread of jealousy there that between my mother and the way that I connected with my grandmother.
I see. She kind of regarded your relationship with your father's mother as a competitive thing with
the T word, threatening. Yes.
Yeah. Oh wow.
And you know, and she was very, very intense, you know,
yeah,
about the Holy Spirit and the Lord. You know,
right.
LAWD. Okay.
Right. I understand.
And my mother was Catholic. And so within that, but my grandmother introduced me to nature. Just the beauty of nature.
When you say that, does that mean she took you like to parks?
Yes, to parks. Yeah, beautiful Golden Gate Park, the Japanese tea garden, to the beach, to all of these things where we could just really just enjoy and revel in just the beauty of nature and just the fluidity of that.
Well, it sounds to me you had a very enriching childhood. I mean, all this exposure to the arts, the nature, etc., that was provided by your parents and grandparents and so forth. It sounds like and their connection with all these folks, County Cullen, Fannie Lou Hamer, and so on.
Oh yeah, and that's what I was going to say. So that's on my grandmother's side, and my parents were members of this the church in San Francisco, which was the first interdenominational church in America, which was pastored by Dr. Howard Thurman, who was my parents' pastor. And so I've been playing the piano for him because he would come to the house, and I remember he'd sit in this chair which was next to the piano, and he loved Beethoven, he loved the Romantic area, and play for Dr. Thurman. And Dr. Thurman was very close to Martin Luther King. He introduced Martin Luther King to Mahatma Gandhi.
No way! Wow.
And he was the first chaplain, African American chaplain of Boston University.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah.
And when you say
prolific author.
Yes. And when you say you played for him, about how old were you when you first started playing for him?
Maybe 7 or 8 years old.
Wow. Okay.
And I remember going to the church because my father sang in the choir. They were very, very involved, and really very, very progressive. This is before he was really a remarkable person, and just being around him and my grandmother. My grandmother was very, very interested in certainly she didn't call it that, but the diaspora, maybe from the viewpoint of orientating people to the quote unquote to the gospel, and particularly in Africa, she read this magazine called the African Challenge. That really, really opened my head. And she would talk about connectivity, and so that's something that's very, very embedded in me from her, which was the whole thing of what we learn, what we're able to advance as a concept, and something that we're able to live by and be inspired and motivated by, is meant to be shared. And so those things that we're able to manifest really is an act of service.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I've felt about musical art, because that was the orientation. And I had a cousin, I should call him like an uncle, but he was who was head of the audiovisual department at San Francisco State University.
Mm-hmm.
And so what he did there, he controlled the acquisition and the dissemination of film. So he controlled the film library.
Uh-huh.
And so he would bring to the house these 16 millimeter films, documentaries, which were of things that had been shot all over the world. I remember that, The Search for the River Nile.
Really?
This, great, classical performers, Isaac Stern, and how he would concertize and take a break. This, looking at volcanic structures and that. So my parents bought a used Bell and Howell 16 millimeter projector in the screen.
And they would show you the films.
And I would watch these movies.
Oh, wow.
And my buddies would come over and watch. See, San Francisco it's beautiful, but it's also foggy and cold. So we would have our 2 or 3 hours playing out, outside, and then it would, get too foggy and cold. And so my buddies would come over and we would watch these films,
What a great
archaeological digs and different historical things, sculptors and how they lived, and and all these things. And so I really thank my cousin for giving me like that opportunity, because there's no other way. My parents wouldn't have had access to that type of a film library. This is a university film library.
Yeah.
And I saw the great pianist. So I really was orientated to a world outside my own.
Yeah.
And I was already living in a couple of worlds anyway.
Right.
Certainly with my grandmother, because I was studying music, and it became very serious to me, in the way that I never saw myself as a musician, because that's something that I always did. But it was central to this place of peace and discovery that I could go to. It just stimulated that imaginative part of my mind.
So it helped to open up your creativity. Is that a fair thing to say?
Well, yeah, just by as much as exposure can.
Sure.
So I had this wonderful exposure to ideas that were outside of me, growing up in a predominantly Black neighborhood in San Francisco in the 60s. And I had two important music teachers, the teachers that I had, because I started studying formally when I was maybe about 5 or 6 years old.
Okay. Well, those private lessons?
I have to say this, that my important teachers, they have been immigrants. First was, she was Polish, Miss Gilbertson, and then I had the wonderful happenstance of connecting with, her name was Geraldine Liniger, was a French-Canadian concert pianist who was still performing at that time.
Mm-hmm.
and she was president of the California branch of the Music Teachers Association. And then I studied with Joan Lee, who's also French Canadian, and she had studied at the Moscow Conservatory. And so I learned this technique of Sieveking technique. And so what I'm saying is, my parents, I guess they felt that I was strong enough to go into that world and not lose myself. So they trusted me to go there. So I would spend hours and hours with them. And when Joan Lee moved from San Francisco to Monterey, Carmel, because her husband was a marine biologist, and he was a doctor and studied, and he'd studied, and he was a professor at Stanford. And there's one of the richest tide pools there in that area of in Carmel. And so as a marine biologist, that's where it was. So when Joan Lee moved to Monterey, what I did, and this is when I was in grammar school, on Fridays, my father would drop me off at school. I'd already be packed up, and he'd come and pick me up after school, take me to Greyhound bus station. I would take the bus by myself to Monterey, which is like about a 2.5 hour ride.
Wow.
And I would study piano and theory with her
while you were in
over the weekend,
school.
and my folks would drive down late Sunday afternoon and pick me up.
So you were spending the night there, basically, or
I was spending the night. I was
nights.
living with her.
Yeah, wow.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
She sounds like a dedicated teacher too, by the way.
Oh yeah, she was quite something, and she's passed away now. But she became like she's like she was a headhunter for the American Symphony system and that, and she was a performing and recording concert pianist as well. So I was in two worlds, you see. Actually with three worlds, see, because the Black neighborhood, Black friends, my grandmother on me about, she's breaking down like, okay, the whole thing of good music and bad music, you know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, which is, the Lord's music, and then
everything else,
secular thing.
Yeah.
And then I'm in this other world where it is strictly classical music, which is my orientation. And then through there, I got connected to Trinity College of Music in London.
And at what point, how old were you when you went to Trinity College?
Well, that actually started, I guess I started that program when I was about 8 years old.
Okay.
Because they sent examiners around the world, and then they had these people who were connected to the university in the States. It was primarily like throughout the Commonwealth. So the Commonwealth being the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. So all my examiners were, of course, they were British. And I grew up in it, because I know your music, you're Mr. Music as well, Eric. See, I grew up on minims and crotchets and quavers,
right?
You see, as opposed to half notes and quarter notes,
right,
and eighth notes.
Right.
So it's a whole other language.
Another way of saying the same thing when it's describing music.
Yeah, different terminology and that. And so I was just completely immersed in that, and bit that came about in large part due because I had this imposed isolation occurring because I had really bad allergies. I had asthma, and I had these other dermatidal issues that went with it, and I couldn't eat anything. Really, it was just very marginal. So I went through this period of about 8 years of being desensitized so I could, eat regularly.
Yeah, sure.
But within that isolation, music became my solitude, and that's where
It kind of helped you through that experience, in other words.
completely saved my life, gave
Yeah.
me,
And
reason,
this is
understanding. Yeah,
this is why you were a child and adolescent. Is that about right?
absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
because I was born with these life-threatening allergies. Absolutely.
Oh, wow.
And it was restrictive, and I finally, came through it after
Yes.
being desensitized and that. And so like in my late teens, I got clear and,
Yes.
very physical in that. But
So
yeah,
at
just that circumstance of early orientation has everything to do with, the depth that I pursued this, the art and music
yes.
and the imaginative sphere.
And at some point you ended up in London, right?
Yes, I did.
And how long were you studying there?
Well, I was in London for almost 4 years because I went there. I had a band. I was on Island Records. It's a band called Automatic Man,
Uh-huh.
and we were a rock band. It was a band that I had with Michael Shreve, who was the original drummer of Santana,
Mm-hmm.
and also phenomenal guitarist Pat Thrall and bassist Donnie Harvey.
Mm-hmm.
And we made this record, which is it's a cult. It's a cult, and actually, it's about to be re-released.
Oh, really?
And yeah, and it's that. And so what that did, it kind of it linked me into this other group that was formed in New York with Vernon Reid, who you may know, from the band Living Color,
Yes.
which is called BRC, which is the Black Rock Coalition.
He was the guitar player, right? Vernon Reid?
Yes, Vernon was. That's right.
Yeah.
And the other co-founder was Greg Tate, who just passed away
I saw that.
about a month ago.
Right.
Just a complete literary giant,
Right.
as well as this highly attuned musician. So what I'm saying, I've just had this other experience with with music and the arts. So through my degree performance, of course, was in classical music. I played Beethoven, Bach. I played a lot of Baroque music and that. And
Yes.
very, very dedicated to what it takes to play the piano, play the instrument there. And I think that's really like my core area of discipline. But what was activated from early on was this expanding curiosity, which came from reading. I've always been just a constant reader. And with music, I really wanted to understand what it meant, what it felt like, and how to play these different forms authentically.
Mm-hmm.
So I heard jazz when I was maybe about 14 years old. I had a cousin who was a pianist. I really, really loved her, Cynthia.
Mm-hmm.
And she lived here in Los Angeles, so I get to spend time with Cynthia. And so she introduced me to Gabor Zabor and Charles Lloyd, where I heard Keith Jarrett and, of course, Cannonball Adderley, the great Austrian pianist, Joe Zawinul.
Yeah. Weather Report, right?
Yeah, Weather Report, yes. And then Wes Montgomery, on which Herbie Hancock was, the pianist on many of those classic recordings that he did for Verve. And
yes,
it was something, it completely captivated me. She's the only person on the planet that could have taken me out of just pursuing classical music.
yes.
And she did it. And yeah, when I went to the piano and realized that I could not get those sounds out of the instrument,
Oh.
I was hooked. And then, of course, as an African-American male, me learning that vernacular of jazz and connecting with the language of blues expression, and in terms of what it meant and what the potential of it was. It was a rite of passage for me.
I was going to say, so you're classically trained with Beethoven and Mozart, etc., and now you have this experience with jazz and blues. That must have been almost like a homecoming in a sense, right? I mean, self-discovery.
Yeah, yeah, it really was, and well, it just connected me to the root. I mean, and I think it's the same as like as a visual artist, you know, putting marks on a, you know, let's say on a two-dimensional plane. Yes, and colors in that, and that's one thing, but to actually express something emotionally as you do that, to transmit that and to transform an emotional perspective through that is art, and that's completely fascinated me.
Yeah, to me, that's
and that's the process that I love, man.
And to me, that's kind of the essence of art. I don't care what kind of art it is. That expressiveness, that's the part that doesn't come from training so much as combining the training that you have for the technical side of it, using all that training, and then through that expressing the emotion and the spirit and the so forth of whatever art form you're pursuing at the point.
And I think it is, and to be fortunate, you know, to be around people who keep you connected to the mother tongue, because a lot of times the dimensions of the craft and the technical can separate you from the vulnerability and the openness and the freedom that you need to really express something beyond words.
Exactly. And I think that cuts across all forms of art, whether it's music or visual art,
absolutely,
poetry or literature. It's that I think that cuts across all those art forms.
I think it's very, very important. And I think, you know, art will always precipitate the larger dynamic of change in an environment, of a society, of a country, you know, of a generation.
Mm-hmm.
I really have always felt that art has the power to make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that once we understand that, if we've been tapped in such a way that there's an aptitude and something that we can pursue, and then we begin to learn how to communicate through this remarkable language, which is infinite.
Mm-hmm.
There's a dimension of responsibility that comes with that.
So what do you mean by that?
I think that that the art needs to reflect the place and the time, the pathos, the moment. It needs to reflect context, and I think it needs to hopefully inspire solutions. I think it should inspire people to understand that we are continually in a state of becoming.
Mm-hmm.
That self-realization is fluid, it's ongoing. I think that there's universality in the life experience of human beings, but access to the fullness of that is not universal. Mm-hmm. And so that's what needs to be spoken on.
Todd, I wanted to ask you, so early on you were talking about how we met and stuff at the gallery, and you saw images you thought would be nice to put on your album cover and so on. And
absolutely,
I just wanted to explore your connection with the visual arts. I mean, it seems one of the things I always admired about you was just that. You did have that impulse. And so I was just wondering, can you trace back when you first became interested in the visual arts, just as an observer or however you were interested?
Well, I'll tell you, this is something that my mother had a really, really refined eye, and she used to do, she would be able to do just beautiful things in the home environment just by placement, you know, which we call, what is it called? What is it? Feng shui? What
Feng
is
shui. Yeah, feng
feng
shui in
shui?
the Chinese
Yes.
culture. Yeah.
Well, she didn't have that. She had sister shui, you know.
which is a relative.
And you know, and just by placement, and she understood lights and
Yeah.
light and
Yes.
you know, shapes and reflective things. And I'm tell you, and she would always be, you know, moving things. I remember my father would say, gee whiz, you know, I just got like used to you know, everything being placed here, and I come home and everything's changed, you know. So it was ongoing. But I'll tell you one thing, my mother had beautiful handwriting.
Oh.
And actually she would she showed me how to hold a pencil and how to make circular motions on pieces on paper, so I could control, you know, the shape of my lettering, which was expressive. And then she had an ability, she sketched beautifully.
Oh, really?
So she would draw these things for me. I know one of these things that she did, she had drawn a picture for me of a indigenous boy, which we called before an American Indian, who was kneeling down and was shooting a bow and arrow. So he was hunting.
Okay.
You know, and let me tell you, and what I would do is I would use like this tracing paper, which is like kind of like onion skin. Oh man, and I copied that. I mean, I copied that at least like you know, 100 times. And she would draw these other things, you know. So I would, you know, I would be able to see things, and she talked about those things. And so I've been in that world trying to understand it as process, because it's so very powerful. I'm trying to remember the great teacher, Robert Henry, great American painter. Phenomenal language about, I know I'm kind of jumping over a couple of spaces here, but I just want to share. I think that art, the fine art world, your world, is way, way ahead of the musical art world in terms of what is actually conveyed and spoken, and what is understood by people who come to seek a certain experience with art. Because I think with art, like an artist, if they get to a certain point where they're able to transmit feeling onto a canvas or into something they've sculpted, it's in the, just historically, it's mandatory that you explain and find a way to articulate your process. And so others begin to learn right away, you see. And so for that reason, like even today, you know, you can have an opening for, you know, art that people have not seen before by a known artist, or, you know, a middle level artist, you know, and you'll have lines around the block. You know, you do the same thing with contemporary music. You know, it is a much, much deeper struggle to get a sizable audience there to have that first experience. And it has everything to do with this mandate that is embedded in part of the greater tradition of art, is that you articulate what this is, you know, the field of emotion, and that's been transmitted. I think you musicians have been much more, like, let me see if I can use this word in a politically correct way, closeted about their process, their struggles in that. And I think that they have represented a lot of those things in a way that certain dimensions are actually remain slightly removed from the truth. And so I look to the art world for that, because I can learn that much more from that. There's that much more to key into. And I'll tell you, my parents had, again, this placement of art in the house, and that my parents had a picture of that hung above their bed in their bedroom.
Uh-huh.
And it was of this man on a horse, and he was in front of this it was a large building, an expansive building. The building actually exceeded the boundaries of the painting itself. But in the foreground, he was on the horse, well dressed, and obviously you could see, even though it was motionless, that he was taking the horse through these maneuvers. And that picture is absolutely fascinated me, because Eric, I'm going to tell you, I have been to every room in that house in my imagination since I was a little boy. I can still go
you can still visualize
in that house that I have visualized, and it tells me whether I'm on point in terms of what I'm expressing creatively, artistically, musically.
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
Yeah.
The interconnectivity of all the arts to me has always been a fascinating thing that I don't think has been highlighted as enough. I remember I represented an artist. His name is William McNeil, and he passed away some years ago. He was an abstract painter, and he told me that he was a big fan of Miles Davis and John Coltrane and all those musicians and stuff. And so he told me that he would actually play the music and set up his palette and his easel and so forth, and more or less channel the music that was being played and translating it into his expression on the canvas with color and line and composition and so forth. It's so I just found that really fascinating, that the interplay between the music.
But Eric, it's always been there.
Yeah.
I think it's just this whole thing of the commodification of these art forms has caused these things to become isolated.
Yes.
When they're always have
interconnected.
They came into existence like that. So why do we do folk? Why is there folk music? Why are people singing together? Why are they coming up with new melodies? Because we're celebrating. We've had a wonderful harvest.
Yes. Yes.
The storm passed, and we're still alive. We might have to rebuild our dwelling spaces, but we're here.
Yes.
A child is born.
Right.
Family members are together.
Yes.
We're able to experience each other. We're able to nurture each other.
Sure.
Inwardly. That came together. So what is that? Okay, there's a sound to that.
Right.
There's absolutely a visual to that.
Sure.
There's attire.
Sure.
There's modality of that. And what I'm saying, and there is the other thing which is really so important. There's a narrative to that.
Yeah. And
so that's the whole thing. I talk about this with artists that I work with. Your performance, it's to be it's a narration. It's not a recitation. You see, you're not to recite, the specificity of certain events, as they're laid out as a compositional structure or something like that. But it is to be narration. There's a narration from in the beautiful painting, behind you, there, between the reflective light in the trombone that he's holding, and then the light behind his hat in the blue sky, and what that actually
it's interesting you bring that up, because the artist who did it is William Pajot, and that's an image of his dad, and it's meant to be a spiritual image. So another thing you brought up earlier was the connection, like you said, your grandmother, I believe, was a minister, a pastor.
Yes, she was an evangelist. Yes.
So the spiritual connection there. So he's already been passed away. If you notice in the painting, his gravestone is in the back, and he was.
I see. Because I can't.
Yeah, it's hard probably for you to see.
Detail.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm just trying to explain that. And his nickname was the Reader, because he was able to read music, and he was a player for the Eureka Brass Band in New Orleans. But the point I'm trying to make is the kind of connection between, like you were talking about, the spirituality of it too is present in that painting, And
Absolutely.
and when you think about church, if you go to church, there's beautiful, maybe stained glass, maybe paintings and sculpture. There's
Right.
always music. There's a choir singing. You said your
Mhm.
dad sang in a choir.
Yes.
I mean, all these art forms come together to help in the community, help in the spirituality, etc. Is all this interconnectivity. It's like a true, to me, true humanities comes to mind. You know, it's like the embodiment of that concept.
And
Human.
that's where we are, you see, because it is integrated. We're fully aspects of the human soul, you know, it's fully integrated.
Yeah.
And what I think it is, like what you're talking about, is like it's knowing that art plays a significant role in the wholeness of life.
Yeah.
And I think particularly like that, and I think about like this certainly from an African American, from the African American perspective. I think we tend, like, ground zero when we think of Black excellence. We think of Black excellence in the context of Black capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
and we often forego the concept of Black excellence as the Black aesthetic.
Yeah.
You see, which is this deeper, far-reaching, elemental. What should I say? Uh, it's the whole thing. When we look at that, what we've seen is creativity and invention that has occurred, that's impacted the entire world, that really represents that we have the capacity of being great makers in the absence of light.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, it's funny because the piece
Yeah,
on
yeah.
on my left and on your right is a sculpture by Meta Fuller, and its title is Water Boy, and it was
Uh-huh.
inspired by a slave work song by the same title, Water Boy.
Uh-huh.
And it's just interesting to me that she would do that. It's an acknowledgement of the slave past, the break off from Africa, the mother country, and uh, it's basically kind of honoring and giving dignity to, notice how upright the figure is standing, to the water boy.
Yes.
I mean, he might have been a slave, but he still maintained throughout that horrible experience his own dignity.
And he brought, and that was infectious.
Yeah.
And that dimension of dignity and how that, like, exists in all these other conflictual contexts, which is the whole. They're not fragments and parts of it. It is absolutely whole.
Mm-hmm.
Is it's actually it's fascinating, because what it does, it moves other people to become aware, the observers, the appreciators, the people who come in touch with it, become aware that there are moments where the physical world can't say everything that needed to be said.
Mm-hmm.
Physical world can't express everything that needed to be transmitted, you know.
Mm-hmm.
The sense of connectivity, the sense of a before and after, the sense of the importance of the foreground in relationship to the background.
Mm-hmm. There's one other thing I wanted to bring up.
Yes.
I remember you telling me one time, it's been quite a while ago, and I'm forgetting the exact context, but you were saying how music can be kind of like a medicine. If you're kind of feeling a little bit, you could play a song
Absolutely.
that has a
That's
certain
right.
feel to it, and it could make you feel better. I always remember that when you told me that, and it's so true. But it shows you the power of that art form, by the way. And I'm pretty sure you can say the same for some other art forms as well. But
I'll tell you. You know, you were talking about the art in these temples of spirituality,
mm-hmm.
or temples or building structures that have been created for ritual. The art was there to inform those who may have been illiterate.
Oh yeah, sure.
And that they didn't get what was the liturgical messaging.
Right.
They didn't understand the inference of these more deeply intellectual transmissions. So the message is there, but within that, there's medicine in the message.
Yeah, sure.
You see, and that's what I think that's what it is. And so, I mean, I guess it's just for me, I guess when someone surrenders to that unknown process of becoming a great musician, a great artist, a great communicator, it takes you past the intellectualism and brings you right to the threshold of the aesthetic, which is this larger thing, you see. So you start fooling around with the world of jazz, then you really got to look at, you have to look at these different languages. You have to look at vernacular poetry. You have to look at the negritude. You have to look at Gullah culture. You have to look at these concepts that came through with Elaine Locke and these
the new Negro and
the new Negro, these moments of manifestos,
right.
And we look at of course, you see what I'm saying. So like that's it, and what you're talking about in this beautiful sculpture of the water boy and that dignity. That's why we want to. Yes, indeed. It's important to read the slave narratives.
Yeah, and to acknowledge it.
And experience the fortitude of the spirit.
Yeah.
And that and what you were talking about earlier, like those connections of the musicality and then the art. You were talking about William McNeill.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I remember this conversation that I watched with Toni Morrison, and she was talking about when she wrote Beloved.
Uh-huh.
Her soundtrack was Cecil Taylor and Ornette Coleman.
Oh.
Who were definitely these
cutting edge, right?
Quote unquote. Well, avant-garde. Ornette Coleman with his harmonics.
Oh yeah. Oh man, it was out there.
That and Cecil Taylor, who was a deep conceptual artist, very, very powerful. And he was actually very close friends with James Baldwin.
Uh-huh.
You see, so these connections have always been there. They're just not really taught. People aren't really like exposed to it, and so I think when we see things in just that have been in isolation,
yes,
there's work to be done, because we can sit around and say, wow, man, people have forgotten and this, and don't and and so you could jump on that wagon and say, well, man, we're surrounded by cultural amnesia.
Yeah. So
but it's really not amnesia. They haven't been orientated to it.
Right.
So how do you show people how to get into that space, Eric? How do I open the door and create a portal for people to come in?
Well, what I've done in the past, I've had my gallery since 1988. And so, of course, I would have traditional gallery receptions where the artist oftentimes was present, sometimes not if they couldn't be. But I would also hold art appreciation classes, which attracted people that were really interested and motivated to learn more, get a little deeper into it. So that was one thing. Also, I always tried to have artists that no one had ever heard of before, so that people be introduced to something they may not have seen otherwise. And so that was another tack that I would take. And so we published some gallery catalogs.
And books of poetry you have too.
Poetry.
And I'll never forget, was really powerful. You've also done things that show the multifacetedness. Gee whiz, I know that's bad English.
No, but I get what you're saying, though. I mean, conveying the concept,
these conceptual artists,
right.
and a couple have come to mind, but the one that I do remember was the show that you did of Amar Baraka.
Oh yeah, right. That was interesting. So not a lot of people realize that he expressed himself not just in literature and poetry, but he did visual arts as well. Amiri Baraka, right? Formerly Leroy Jones.
But this occurs, they're usually connected. Just one supersedes the other. People don't know that Ralph Ellison really wanted to be a musician.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's all these.
And
the artist that I'm talking to about this, Mita Fuller, she wrote poetry as well, by the way. She was a sculptor, right, but she also wrote poetry. So it's multifaceted, as you mentioned before.
Well, because they come together, and I think that's kind of, my experience has gone like to these different areas, because I'm really, really curious,
Yeah.
And one, it excites me, and it just is, I'm just able to communicate that much better.
Yeah.
The more that I learn about these fascinating.
I do want to ask you, you mentioned some of the key musicians that you admire and were influenced by. I was curious, do you have any visual artists whose works that stand out in your mind as being particularly interesting and influential?
Absolutely. Because one piece, and we may have talked about this at some of the is Henry Ozawa Tanner.
Ah, yes.
And there are a couple of pieces of his which were one about being thankful.
Oh, the Thankful Poor.
The Thankful Poor.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
Very powerful. One of his most iconic and famous paintings.
And then there's another of his, which is the banjo lesson,
involving music and imparting that knowledge from generation to generation.
But you see, like in that depiction, it skipped a generation, because it was grandpa and
grandson. Exactly.
It wasn't the son.
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. It skipped
that's
a generation.
Another level of teaching. It was elevated, and actually, I wrote a piece of music called the banjo lesson, which was inspired by that painting.
Oh, okay, fantastic. That's awesome.
To share with you. Oh yeah, I've been really, really inspired by painters.
Yeah, excellent.
No, I find it completely fascinating. Of course, I love. Now I'm going blank, because I wanted,
One person I know I saw you just on Facebook communicating with Mark Greenfield, who had been on one of my podcast guests, actually.
Yes.
Very innovative and talented artist himself,
Yeah, and he's very powerful in what it is that he expresses.
Yes.
But I saw like his latest work, I commented on him. It seemed like he's had like a breakthrough.
Yeah.
There's more, he's such a very, very talented, technically he's really powerful.
Absolutely.
And he images very strongly, but I'm feeling like a state of flow in these more recent things that he's done. There's a fluidity in it, which I, haven't had a chance to talk to him about, because actually we Zoomed like about a month ago.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. And it's really something. I mean, and just like that, my most current release, Then and Again, Here and Now, with my trio. It's the first recording that I've done of standards, where I've contemporized them, and I think that's very similar to some things that we're seeing like occurring in the art world, contemporizing images and highlighting inference and recontextualizing, because we look at like Kehinde Wiley.
Kehinde Wiley, yeah.
Yeah, Kehinde Wiley, and who redid what was it? The painting by Thomas Gainsborough, the portrait of young gentleman.
Yeah.
And he
that hangs in the Huntington.
And he did the Blue Boy. So I'm saying, we're taking these things that we have lived with, and that have been transformed. The standards, the American Songbook and jazz classics, they have been there, but they have through innovation. They like there are whole styles that have, been birthed
Yeah.
through that reimagining and contextualizing. But like the allegorical aspect is still there.
Yeah.
And so I think that makes this period that we're in right now particularly impactful. I would be interested in your take on what you feel people who are go to the arts for a certain type of experience. What do you think that they're seeking at this moment in time? Because everything has really been.
No, I just think in some cases transcendence from where they are now, in other cases inspiration. I mean, it's a variety of things, I think. But before we're kind of running a little bit low on time, but I do want to.
Okay, that's fine.
No,
sure.
I just want to bring up this one thing though. You recorded. I remember you sending me a text telling me that you had recorded 3 duets with Maya Angelou, who I just saw, and you also sent me that information too. That she's going to be the first African American female on the back of a U.S. quarter.
Right.
Yeah. So what was that like, if you don't mind saying real quick? And then after that, if you could just tell the audience how they can learn more about what you're doing now and so forth.
Oh, yeah. Well, it came about just as many of these things like come about. What was really there was I had scored the music for a film called Woman Thou Art Loose, which was actually, when I'm very, very proud of the film and I worked with Michael Schultz as the director. And then the producer on that wanted to put me together with Maya, because she was going to direct a film called, after the book, it was called Singing in the Comeback Choir.
Okay.
Which was really something I'll never forget. And I'm going blank for her name. And she passed away. And I'll never forget, I had taken my mother, I had moved my folks down here from San Francisco. And I would take my mother around with me, and I'd taken her to the party. And so she had met the author of the book, and they had a really wonderful connection.
Oh, excellent.
And with Maya, this is a project that I did with Stanley Clark.
Oh, yes, the bassist.
And actually, Stanley's playing on a couple of things. The 2 things that I shared with you are just duets with me and Maya. One letter to an aspiring junkie, which basically says, it's metaphorical.
I understand.
Deep teaching.
I understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she's singing, by the way, right? Is she singing?
She's speaking. She's doing speaking. The spoken. Yeah, she's delivering.
Okay.
Yes.
And you're playing the piano.
Yes, and I'm playing the piano, right. And so I'm really proud of that, because actually we have a shared copyright,
Oh, fantastic.
But she's a remarkable person. And of course, San Francisco is in her history as well.
Yes.
And I think it's it's a momentous time that we're in right now. I think, if I could frame it, I think that we're really at the combination of the pandemic and things that have been said about where we are, and of course, post George Floyd, and some of the responses that we're getting, across society in an enlarged way. I think it's part of this period that Cornel West has framed, and he really articulates it in a very expansive way. But he sees this moment like as a part of a moment of prophetic redemption, which is a very, very high-minded concept.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that means going and rendering excellence within these contexts, genre, idiomatic expressions that we understand and that have been codified and classified and commodified. I think that language really is talking about going to the deep deep, deep imaginative well in formulating something that is absolutely fresh, that has all of those attributes of technical proficiency, the classicism,
Right.
the folk, the rhythm, the lyrical composition,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the melodious, healing,
Right.
uh, dynamics, and that pulse that touches us in a special way.
Yeah.
When we look to art to have a special experience.
Now, speaking of art, before we go, I just want to
Yes. No.
call out the piece that's right behind you. That
Yes.
beautiful painting was done by
my wife.
your wife, exactly.
Yes.
I just want to call that out.
Oh yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's
yes.
a very, very nice painting.
And it's ongoing.
Yeah, excellent.
So, yeah, she's.
So Todd, before we go, please tell everybody if they wanted to look you up. You have a website and so forth. You want to share with everybody, or?
Yes, sure. I'm it's pretty easy. www.toddcochran, TODD Cochran, COCHRAN.com. And my focus at this point, of course, is my trio.
Yeah, and you mentioned
called TC3, and it's Then and Again, Here and Now, and we will be performing this year. Things have been completely pushed back due to the pandemic.
Oh, of course.
Everything is just like that. And actually, I was supposed to be in New York last week. I was co-chairing a gathering for Chamber Music America called Convening in New York, where actually we were discussing the first day was the technical. These are the audio recorders and the videographers, short filmmakers.
Yes.
Second day are the managers and agents. The third day, which is particularly of interest, I know to you as well, which has to do with the commentarians, you know, the authors, the journalists, and the critics.
Right.
You know, because I know that, and that's something I've always admired, you know, about you, you know, how you've, you know, really articulated, you know, an understanding in your written pieces about,
thank you,
you know, this whole connectivity of art and what that experience is, and the potential it has. And it's very beautiful. And then on the other side, I have my art and music, which is certainly that of the, you know, of the classical tradition. And I'm working on completing a project now that I'm very excited about.
Excellent.
And so I'm in both worlds there, that of jazz, the contemporary there, and we're really pushing that edge. I'm very, very proud of the ensemble. And then this whole, you know, contemporary new music. And I tell you, it is fully integrated with the visual medium. And because I've been making short films here for about the past 6 or 7 years.
And how would we see that? Is that accessible through your website?
Yes, it is. Okay. Yeah, there's one called announcing this trio, introducing the trio. It's a short film that I did, and it's called 3 Days Before.
Okay.
And you can find that. You can search that on YouTube, and I'm using compositing and that, as well as the camera work and lights, and you know, you have a part in that too, because people don't know that Eric Hanks is also a very excellent photographer.
Thank you. I appreciate that, man. Thanks a lot.
So that's the Renaissance / you know, multifaceted,
thank you,
hyphenated, you know, man, you know, and so I took the dive, you know.
Excellent.
And it's been great. Yeah, I'm working with some wonderful filmmakers. I had a film that was in I became an ambassador of the Pan-African Film Festival last year. And that was a film that I did with Hornist Bob Watt, which is called Todd Cochran in Conversation with Todd Cochran. I mean, and with Bob Watt in conversation.
And we should say that Bob was with the LA Philharmonic, right?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was he was there for 37 years.
Yeah.
He was the first African American hornist in the American Symphony system.
Yeah.
And he's also an author, and he's finishing his second book now.
Yeah. Excellent.
And so it's all, well, I think it's a wonderful moment in time.
Thank you very much, Todd. I really appreciate you sharing all that information with us and spending time with us here on Eric's Perspective. I greatly appreciate it. We're all very excited about what you've got coming out, and I encourage everybody listening and watching to check out Todd's website and be on the lookout for any performances that are coming up and checking out his movie. Todd, thank you so much for sharing your perspective today.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And thank all of you out there in the listening and viewing world. And I encourage you all to please don't forget to subscribe. Thanks a lot.